Well, hey everybody, it's Mr. Schauber, and welcome to our political participation and voting presentation. I hope you enjoy it. I hope you learned something about the history of um, different groups being able to get the right to vote, and uh, and what it looks like today as far as political participation within our society. You know, in the early years of the American colonies, uh, basically the colonists just brought with them what they knew from England. And so, from the earliest days of Jamestown in Virginia and Plymouth in modern day Massachusetts, and then eventually all 13 colonies, they just got used to living according to not only what they thought was right and appropriate, but what England had done for centuries, really. And so that's what the colonists did. Their colonial constitutions reflected English law and customs, and that's just how they got used to living. As far as voting in the original colonies, though, most of them allowed only adult white men that owned land to vote, and they did that because they thought, well, they have a bigger stake in society, they have more of an interest in you know the laws and regulations of society, and so you had to own some land to be able to do that. And like I said, it was only white men. And along with what I just said, you can see that a lot of people thought that landowners were the only ones that were responsible enough to make political decisions because they were probably a little more educated. Uh, they just had more of a stake in society and what was done and how things operated. And so, of course, we look at that now and we say, well, how could they do that? How could they allow only people with land to vote? It's so elitist and exclusive, and it is by today's standards, but they thought it was, I guess, they thought it was normal and appropriate to do that. So this left, these other groups out of the voting process in the early days of the colonies. And, you know, again, we look at that and we say, well, how horrible. And yeah, by today's standards, we want everyone that can vote to be able to vote, but that's not how it was early on. So when the framers were writing the Constitution in 1787, they weren't quite sure who they should give the right to vote to. Of course, white men who own land could vote, but they weren't sure if they should give it to other groups or not. And so what they decided was that they would leave it up to the states to determine voting rights in each state. And this kind of took the onus off the federal government and gave it to the states. And so states then would regulate these laws about voting and political participation. And they did that for many years. Over time, states eventually dropped the requirement that you had to own land to vote. And, you know, as with anything, some states were quicker on this than others. New York, you can see, got rid of the property requirement in 1821. Rhode Island did not change until 1880. So but again, it was up to the states, and this idea of states, 10th Amendment, state powers, and states had the ability to decide about voting. Well, eventually, all white men got the ability to vote because the states dropped the property requirement. But like we just said in the last slide, it was white men. And so, what about black men? What about white women? What about black women? What about Native Americans? And other groups. And so, you'll see here um, for African Americans, men, it was the 15th Amendment ratified in 1870, 5 years after the Civil War got over, that technically gave black men the right to vote. And, we can see here what the amendment states. It says that citizens shall not be denied the right to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So that technically meant that, I mean, wouldn't white women and black women be able to vote as well by the 15th Amendment? And well, you'd think so, but it was up to the states again to decide within their state who could vote and who could not. And so black men got the right to vote because of this 15th Amendment, but not other minority groups. And so, as we can see here, the technicalities of, well, the literal interpretation of the 15th Amendment said that former slaves could not be turned away due to the color of their skin and the fact that they've been slaves. And so this is going to lead states to, again, allow black men to vote for a time, especially in the South. A lot of these southern states are not going to like this, that black men are going to the polls, because when you have a right to vote, and if elections are fair and votes are counted fairly, uh, that can change who's in office. That can change policy of politicians. So the law can change when you give people the right to vote. So black men had the right to vote, and you'll see for a time they enjoyed this right, but eventually southern states came up with ways to deny them the right to vote. All right, women's vote. Well, white women got the right to vote finally after a long struggle. Um, Now, individual states could give women the right to vote, and territories could give women the right to vote on their own within their states or territories. But on a federal level, it didn't happen for quite a while. Now, you can see Wyoming gave women the right to vote in 1869. They were the first to do that. Utah was second the next year. Uh, but it took the work of people like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and and others to get the job done on a federal level. And so it wasn't until 1920, with the passage of the 19th Amendment, that women got the right to vote, white women got the right to vote in federal elections in the United States. And that's what the 19th Amendment says. Now, what about Native Americans? They were not actually considered citizens of the US until 1924. Before that, they were considered members of their own tribal governments. And so they were not allowed to vote in federal elections because of that. Um, Once they became citizens in 1924, then they started, obviously, to have voting rights. And you can see President Calvin Coolidge signed the Indian Citizenship Act in 1924, and it gave them the rights and privileges of American citizenship, and so voting came along with that. Now, residents of the District of Columbia, people who lived in DC, did not get the right to vote in presidential elections until the 23rd Amendment in 1961. People lived there, but they didn't. They weren't, because they were a district and not a state. They were not given the right to vote on a federal level in presidential elections. You can see, until just 1961. So, kind of interesting. That was kind of just a caveat that we don't usually think about, but that's when that happened. And like we said, going back to what we talked about a few minutes ago, even after the Civil War, a lot of people in the South didn't want African American men or any African Americans to have the same rights as white Americans. And so they didn't want black men to be able to vote, even though the 15th Amendment said they could. And so some states passed laws that basically made it impossible for black men to vote and eventually wiped out the black man's vote. So states and individual counties used a lot of different methods to prevent blacks from voting. You can see, I'll list them here. They limited opportunities to register. They'd get arrested or beaten by the police if they tried to vote. So it was intimidation tactics and threats of violence. And personal information shared with groups like the KKK and employers. So, hey, better not vote, or else, we'll tell people where you live, and we'll give people your personal info, tell them about your family, things like that. I mean, these are pretty low tactics, but these were used. And of course, unfair tests at the polls. We'll talk about that in just a second. The literacy test. Okay, so this was one of the unfair tests, right? You have to, this was given in some locations, voters were tested on their reading and writing skills. Well, most of these African Americans had been, especially in the South, they'd been slaves, not too long before, and they weren't allowed to learn how to read and write. So there's no way they could pass a literacy test. And of course, like with the other tests, white voters always passed because they were basically given a pass, while African American voters usually did not. Just the cards were stacked against them. It wasn't a fair deal, but that was one way the states really, cut down on the black vote. You can see here for literacy tests in Alabama, read a section of the Constitution out loud, tell what the section says in your own words, and write out another section of the Constitution, and then answer questions about the Constitution. In Louisiana, voters who could not prove a fifth grade education had to complete a 30-question test, do it in 10 minutes. Most people who were literate probably couldn't do that. So again, these were ridiculous, but these were ways that, again, because the states controlled the specific laws about voting, uh, that they could come up with these goofy requirements. And so again, most African American men, not too long after the 15th Amendment was passed, were basically eliminated from the voting pool. Then you throw in the poll tax. Some places use this, and we've talked about these before, but the poll tax required voters to pay for the ability to vote. So if you wanted to vote, you pay a fee. And, most Southern blacks were poor after the Civil War, and many of them were poor for many years after. Many of the whites in the South were poor for, decades after the Civil War. But you couldn't afford to pay to vote on top of everything else. And so, again, the poll tax eliminated a lot of people's votes. You can see, $1.50 in 1932 was like 23 bucks today. And you can see this up above here. This poll tax receipt is from 1932. I mean, that's crazy. Places were still using this well into the 1900s. And then, of course, to top it all off was the grandfather clause. And again, these should be review for you. You should have learned about poll taxes and literacy tests and grandfather clause. But the grandfather clause said that you could vote if your grandpa could vote. Okay, um, and if you were an African American who'd been a slave, that meant your dad and your grandpa had been slaves, and so they couldn't vote. And so, of course, I mean, how ridiculous, right? But these were, again, just tactics that states, especially in the South, used. And by the 1880s, 90s, especially, the black man's vote in the South was all but eliminated. And so the civil rights movement, which really gained steam in the 1950s and 1960s, really had two purposes. And it was to remove those segregation laws, the Jim Crow laws and the black codes and all those things that had, the separate but equal stuff. They wanted to remove those segregation laws in the South. And also, it was to restore African Americans' ability to vote, which had basically been denied to them, by this time, 1950s, 1960s. They'd basically been denied for, well over a half a century. And so uh, the marches and the boycotts and the sit-ins and the freedom rides, all this is what we know as the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr. is the face of it. Other people as well became famous because of it. But it was really to get African Americans' freedoms back and restore those voting rights. One of the ways they did that, the 24th Amendment, added to the Constitution in 1964, eliminated the poll tax. And that was, again, one way that you could start to restore African Americans' voting rights. Also in 1964, and you can see President Lyndon B. Johnson here with Martin Luther King, uh, Congress uh, wrote up and presented to President Johnson the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which started to get rid of these segregation laws and so forth. And of course, Johnson he felt pressured to sign it, and he did. And so this puts really they're on kind of a fast track now to get black rights and voting rights back. But the poll tax ban in 1964 was a really good start. And then in 1965, the Voting Rights Act was signed by President Johnson. So he signed the Civil Rights Act in 64, the Voting Rights Act in 65. And once and for all now, this law protected the right for all citizens to vote, okay, who were 21 and older. And so it forced also the states to obey the Constitution and follow the federal mandate. And so this now in 1965 gives the right to vote to all other people 21 and older who had not previously had the right to vote, which by this time is basically, well, it restores black man voting, and and it gives black women the right to vote as well. And like we said, it reinforces the 15th Amendment, which should have been, of course, uh, observed all along, and which was ratified 95 years earlier than 1965, but basically had, like we said, it had been ignored largely by most states and by the federal government when it comes down to it. All right, so the last group to get the right to vote are the 18-year-olds, and that, of course, that happens because in the 60s and early 70s, the Vietnam War is going on, and these young guys are going off to fight, 18, 19 years old, but the voting age was 21, and they're coming back and they say, hey, wait a minute here, we need to change something because we're taking, we're fighting and we're taking bullets for our country, but we can't even vote on who our politicians are. And so Congress uh, acted on that, of course, and things got changed. They got changed in 1971 with the 26th Amendment, lowering the voting age to 18, which means that you guys listening to this, as seniors in high school about ready to graduate, many of you are 18 or will be 18 by summertime, or at least early fall. You will be able to vote in the next presidential election. And so this is what the 18th Amendment, excuse me, the 26th Amendment, which allows 18-year-olds to vote, says. The right of citizens of the United States who are 18 years of age or older shall not be denied. And there was the saying, right? Old enough to fight, old enough to vote. That's what the people who supported this that was definitely one of their platform chants. Okay, so I think I've referenced this before in another PowerPoint, but look how many amendments deal with voting. It's really interesting. If you're um, if you're looking at the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and then the other amendments, all 27 amendments in total, man, a bunch of them have to do with voting. And so obviously this has been an issue over the years, and you can see certain groups were denied at certain times, but over the years, little by little, right, amendments have been added that have extended the right to vote to all these groups. So pretty good. Like I said, hopefully we fixed the problems of the past as far as voting goes, and we've made things right. All right, so just a little humor me for a second, if you would. A little exercise in in trying to prove a point. So I wrote on here, okay, here's a situation. It's all up to you, the voter, to determine the fate of the country. For each of these questions, vote the answer you think is best. Remember, the fate of the nation rests in your hands. No pressure, right? And if we were in class and had more time to do this, we'd probably just make an activity out of this. But I've abbreviated the activity for this purpose on this PowerPoint, but like I said, just kind of indulge me for a second and let's see here. If you were to have to answer these questions, what would you say? Question one, what should be the national color? Blue, green, red, yellow, or other? You're probably sitting there thinking, what is this purpose? Why are we doing this? Well, again, just stay with me here. But, if you had to answer this, what would you say? And of course, if you say other, you would have to write in your answer. You'd have to, write in a response, an option. But there's a purpose to this. So there you go. There's the first question, national color. All right, the second question. Should the Supreme Court have ruled Arizona SB 1070 legal and acceptable? Yes or no? Now you might be sitting there saying, wait a minute here, I don't know what Arizona SB 1070 is. How do I make a decision? Well, that's going to prove my point here in just a second. But if you had to say yes or no, what would you say? And if you're not informed on the issue, and you still might want to make a selection, is that the smartest thing to do if you're not informed and educated on the issue? Is it still smart to make a choice or not? I'll leave that up to you. Question 3, what should be the national ice cream flavor? Vanilla, strawberry, mint chocolate chip, cookies and cream, or other? And of course, if you say other, you have to write in your selection. But again, kind of a dumb question, right? Ice cream flavor, what? But it's going to prove a point here. Question number 4, what should be the national sport? Basketball, baseball, football, soccer, or other? Question 5, should the US government completely shut down Guantanamo Bay? You might be wondering, what is Guantanamo Bay? What the heck? What do we do there? Well, yes or no? Should we shut it down? And if you're saying, well, wait a minute, Schaber, this is not fair. I don't know enough about Arizona SB 1070. I don't know enough about Guantanamo Bay, but I do know about ice cream, and I do know about colors, and I do know about, you know what I mean? Well, yeah, that's my point. Okay. And question 6, what should be the national pet? Cat, dog, horse, goat, or other? Again, you might have strong feelings about some of these questions, and you might be totally uninformed about others. But that's gonna, like I said, that's gonna prove my point here. So this is the moral of this little activity is it easy to vote for things that you already know a lot about or have strong feelings about? Well, yeah, it probably is. If you know a lot about something, it's probably pretty easy to cast a vote for that because you have a strong opinion. You really you think one thing is right, you think one thing is good, so you vote that way. But the second question is voting just a popularity contest? You know, that's a question I've wondered about over the years, and sometimes, I think it kind of is. When we look at like junior high uh, SBO elections, well, who usually wins? Is it the most popular kid running? Well, sometimes it is, right? And who wins when we vote for president? When we vote for senator? When we vote, do we put the thought in? Do we do our research? Do we do our due diligence to really study the candidates and vote for them based on who we think is best? Do we do our research on issues like Guantanamo Bay or Arizona SB 1070, and that are going to be on the ballot? And after our research, do we vote according to what we think is right, or do we just go to the voting booth not having done any research and just vote willy nilly because we're there to vote, so let's just put something down? So maybe it's, the moral of the story is it's easy to vote for things that we feel strongly about, that we've heard a lot about, things like that. But maybe it's not so easy to vote for things that we don't know anything about. And so that brings up the third question. Should people be allowed to vote for things that they don't know anything about? Well, part of what we've, done over the years with all the passage of these different amendments and people, marching for the right to vote and fighting for the right to vote, uh, that would suggest that, yeah, you should be able to vote. If you're 18 or older, you should be able to vote whether you're educated or not on the issues or the people running. Um, and of course, the government's not going to take that away. They're not going to test you in your knowledge when you go to the voting booth. But should you be allowed to vote for things you don't know anything about? Well, of course, you're going to be allowed to vote. But should you cast a vote if you don't know anything about a topic? Are you doing more harm than good? Well, I don't know, maybe. And so the moral of the story, I think, is we need to be educated when we go and vote. And when we show up to the polls, we need to know what we're voting for and who we're voting for. And, a lot of influences go into our opinions, especially if we haven't done the research ourselves. We rely on other people's opinions and maybe media opinions and so forth to form our own opinion. Well, I guess my plea to you is do your own research, do your own checking on politicians and what their stances are. Do your own research on issues, initiatives that come up, and then vote your conscience on those things. But definitely go in educated, and then you'll be able to feel confident about what you're voting for. So here we go. Modern voting. Each state controls its own elections. For example, in Utah, you must be a U.S. citizen, a resident of the state of Utah, and at least 18. Of course, 18 or older is a federal thing. Federal laws include, of course, color of skin and gender and so forth. Everybody can vote that's 18 or older, no matter your race, no matter your religion, no matter your gender. But the states can control some of the little specifics. So, like, you have to be a resident of Utah. Okay, if you moved here from another state and you don't have residency yet, then you can't vote in Utah elections. Um, and so how to register. If you go to that website that I've listed on the bottom there, uh, that will teach you how to register to vote. It is so easy. It literally takes you like 60 seconds. Basically, to register to vote, they need your name and your address so they know where to send. If you're doing a mail-in ballot, they can send your ballot there. But also so they can tell where you live. So when you show up to your voting booth in your precinct, that your name will be on the registry, and because you live within the boundaries of that precinct. So, but basically, it's really easy to vote. And if you move residences out, if you move residences, you want to re-register just to make sure that they have your name and address accurate when you show up to vote. So, but it's so simple. And so, guys, everybody go register to vote using this website here, and you know, it's pretty cool that you can do that. All right, so let's look at some of the particulars then. We know who can vote, okay, and 18 and older, basically everybody in the country. And so, do people vote though? Who actually shows up to vote, and who stays home, and why? What would cause and determine that? Well, like we said, throughout U.S. history, the ability of the population to vote has increased dramatically. Yet the percentage of people who vote has not increased the same way. In fact, percentages have often decreased over the years. So why would that be? What the heck's up with that? If more people can vote, why aren't percentage wise more people showing up to vote? Well, you can see here voter turnout in the US for presidential and midterm elections. Of course, the presidential elections are held every 4 years. Uh, our last one was in 2016. This one, this coming up year, will be held in November of 2020. Midterm elections are held um, in the off years every couple of years. Okay, and so midterms, where we vote for uh, senators, where we vote for representatives, and so you can see the percentage of people going to vote in midterms. If we can get 50%, like we had in 1914 and almost had in 2018, 50% in midterms is considered a tremendous turnout. Uh, you can see sometimes the uh, midterm percentage has gone down to 32%, 37%. We're averaging a lot of times around 40%. So only 40% of eligible voters are making the determination on who our senators and who our representatives are that control taxes and control budgets. And I mean, that's a big deal, right? And then for presidential elections, you can see uh, we had in 2016 we had 60%. Some years we've had upwards of 65%. Some years are down 50% or below. And so it's crazy to think again of the electorate, 60% or less are showing up to vote for president, oftentimes, and 50% or less are showing up to vote for your senators and your reps. Uh, if we got a grade for that, a school grade, well, we'd be failing in both categories basically. That's crazy. So, so why? So why are people not showing up to vote? In why don't we have 80 or 90%? Well, there's probably some reasons that go into that. And here are some of those factors. A person's personal background, their level of education, their income, their age, their racial and ethnic background, and their religion. Actually, they do studies on these things. They research all of these factors, and uh, well, I'm going to show you some of the results here in just a second. But all of these things do, in fact, and have proven to determine a person's likeliness to vote or not. Here's your turnout by education in the US, and you can see on the bottom there is the key. But um, if you have less than a high school education, you're most people are not showing up to vote very much. And then you can see high school grads in red, and some college to college grads in green, and then postgraduate in the purple. So generally, the higher the amount of education, the more likely a person is to vote. Here's income. And you can see on the bottom there in thousands of dollars. Generally, the higher the income, the more likely you are to vote. Kind of interesting too. It's almost just like almost like steps just going up. It's pretty consistent there overall, and that's kind of interesting, I think. But the more money a person makes, generally they're going to show up more often to vote. All right, voter turnout by age. Now I said you guys can vote when you're 18, and yet the 18 to 29 crowd shows up the least to vote, while the 60 and over crowd shows up the most to vote. Now again, there are multiple reasons. Why do people show up more if they're more educated, if they make more money, if they're older? It, maybe more time on their hands. Maybe they have more time to study the issues. All these are going to be reasons, excuses, factors, whatever you want to call them. But I think so many people in this country, we take our voting rights for granted, and so. But it's interesting to me, yeah, why the older people show up more often to vote um, than the younger people. I don't know, and I fall into that red category at the moment, and I'm the second lowest that shows up to vote, and you know it's crazy, but I'd love to see everybody up at 80% or higher, no matter the income, the age, the education level, but it's just not that way. And then ethnicity. How does that determine vote out or turnout rates to vote? When you can see, um, generally, uh, whites and African Americans show up the most to vote. Um, Hispanics, Asian Americans, less usually, but and other ethnicities and minorities. But yeah, this is a little more even in a lot of ways than the education and the income. Um, but anyway, these are interesting to me just to look at. All these categories are interesting to just to kind of observe and kind of analyze but why? But no matter what you're making as far as money, no matter what your ethnicity is, no matter what your education level is, we're still not getting a super high percentage um, overall of the population, right? If we're only getting 60% or less of the overall electorate in presidential elections and 50 or 40%, in midterms. So kind of interesting. But why are people not showing up, at 80, 90, 100% turnout rates? And here are some other factors that influence voters. Issues on the ballot. If a issue is super super big and important to a person, of course they're probably going to show up to vote. They may show up to vote for just that issue. How a candidate is presented by the media. That is huge. The media can make or break somebody almost overnight. You probably have noticed. You probably noticed in the last year or so, if you followed all the candidates that were initially running, especially on the Democratic side for the 2020 election. Certain candidates were given a lot of love by the media, and certain candidates were not given the love by the media. And man, the media is powerful. So if they throw their support behind you and write positive articles and show positive, spots on TV and uh, positive, sound bites, then man, your popularity is going to go up because, well, a lot of people think, hey, if the media is pumping somebody up, then they must be good. And of course, a lot of people are wise to the media, and they realize that the media does this and plays favorites, but the media can really make or break somebody. A third factor, the candidates' commercials and other use of media. Do they strike a chord with you as the voter? Some candidates are just more likable, uh, and of course, the media can help put them in a likable light. But you know, we as human beings, we just kind of gravitate towards certain people of certain personalities and so forth, and so certain candidates just resonate with us. And how the candidate is perceived by friends and family of the voter. If your friends and family are big time in support of somebody, there's a chance that you will be too. And I'm not saying you don't think for yourself as a voter, but a lot of us are very influenced by people around us and their opinions. And so all these things go into it. All these factors I just showed you, all the ones on this screen, they all go into a person showing up to the polls or not, and if they do show up to the polls, how they vote. So, how do we vote? When you go to the polls, you can vote straight ticket in a lot of places, which basically means if you're a Republican and you want to vote for all the Republicans on the ballot, or if you're a Democrat and you want to vote for all the Democrats on the ballot, you just basically uh, punch one ticket, or you click one button on the screen and it votes straight ticket. It votes for every person of that uh, political party. So your voting literally takes about 5 seconds. Other people, prefer, vote more on conscience. Perhaps I'm not saying the people that vote straight ticket don't, but the split ticket is where you're voting. You might vote for a Republican here, a Democrat there, an Independent there, type thing. Okay, and then issue voting also affects how we vote. Uh, Prospective voting means here's how I think an issue is going to play out. This issue's on the ballot. Here's how I think it's going to play out. I'm going to vote for this, or this candidate I think has the potential to do this because they've promised, such and such. Retrospective voting is where, because of how things turned out in the previous election with initiatives or candidates, then we vote that way. Maybe we're happy with how things have been going, so we continue to vote for that candidate or that party, or that type of thing. Or maybe we're upset about how things were going, and so we vote the other way. So these are all ways that are reasons people vote and ways people vote. Now, real quick, there are three kinds of elections. There's the primary elections, the general elections, and then elections on specific issues. Um, And I mean, this seems kind of self-explanatory, but let me explain this real quick so you understand kind of how this works. In the primary election, this is one where each party selects one candidate that will represent their party in the general election. So, for example, leading up to the 2020 election over the last couple of years, President Trump was probably always going to win the Republican nomination, but there were still like three or four other candidates, Republicans, that threw their name into the ring and said, "Yeah, I want to be considered for the Republican nominee." Okay, so you got four or five people overall. The Republicans will have to pick one of them at a nominating convention. These conventions usually happen in the summertime, June, July, sometimes into August before the November election, and that one candidate then will represent you know their party. The Democrats had like 20 people that wanted to be the candidate, and over time, of course, media likes certain people, doesn't like others, pumps certain people up. Voters kind of in initial primaries in their states, they go in and vote and say, yeah, I'd like this person to be the nominee, or I like that person to be the nominee. And so the party gets an idea of who the voters want, who who's kind of popular. And so the Democrats then, this summer at their convention would pick one of those like 20 people, and they would be the nominee. So, and it may have been a little less than 20, but it was like 17 or 18, I think. So, but anyway, yeah, that's how that works. Is each party picks one candidate of all the people that wanted to be their party's nominee to represent them in the general election, which is the final election in November. Okay. And so the winner of this election simply gets to represent their party in the general election. They do not win the right to hold any elected office. They still have to then campaign against the nominee from the other party, one Democrat, one Republican, and they have debates, and they all kinds of commercials on TV and all kinds of stuff. And then in November, the voters and the Electoral College will choose one of those two to be the president. Okay. And of course, if they win the general election, then they assume office that they were running for. Now, this doesn't only apply to president; it also applies to senators and reps and things like that uh, within their states and within their districts that want to run. You might have 3 or 4 Republicans or 3 or 4 Democrats who want to be a senator, and so you have your primary elections, and then you have the general election, and that's what we get to go and vote for in November when we show up to the voting booth. All right, as far as congressional elections go, there's just some terms here. An incumbent is the person currently holding office. And oftentimes the incumbents, they've served the previous term, they want to continue to serve, and so they run again. An open seat is a congressional election in which there is no incumbent. The person, has decided not to run again, or they were involved in some kind of a scandal, and their party basically has said you're not going to run again, or they passed away. So that's an open seat. Okay. A safe seat is a congressional district that's pretty much certain to vote for the candidate of one party. And, if you live in certain part or certain cities in this country today or certain states, there's a pretty good chance if you're a Republican, you're going to win, or if you're a Democrat, you're going to win, depending on the city, the state, the district, wherever that you're running. And so, because some of these areas of our country are very much, more liberal and Democrat, or some are very much more conservative and Republican. And so, anyway, that's what these terms mean. Now, as far as running for reelection, when a member of Congress chooses to run for reelection, they win in an overwhelming percentage of the time. Since World War II, about 92% of all House of Representatives incumbents that run for reelection win reelection. And in the Senate, it's about 78% they win again. So basically, if you win an election, and then you're the incumbent running for reelection, and you've done a halfway decent job in your voters' minds, then they vote for you again and you win again. So that explains how we have senators who serve 6-year terms at a time. They can be in there for 42 years, or reps who serve for 2 years at a time. They could be in there for 20, 30 years or more, right? These people usually just keep winning once they win one time. And so can we explain how and why this happens, especially in light of the information presented? If we were to look at, and I actually had eliminated the previous slide, which was the congressional job approval. But basically, when asked how people think Congress is doing, generally people say, "Oh, they're doing terrible. I can't stand what Congress does. Oh, they spend too much." And so people usually rail on Congress, but yet they keep reelecting their congressman. And so I don't know exactly how you explain that, but other than, we get familiar with names. Once a person wins, they're in office, we get familiar with who they are. And a lot of times we're kind of too lazy to do research on the other candidates that are trying to unseat, the incumbent. And so we just vote for the incumbent again, and then we keep re-electing them. And that's kind of the explanation that basically we have for that. So anyway, but yeah, if you win one time, your chances of winning again are really high. All right, so the election process in the United States looks like this. We have the party nomination process, both Republicans and Democrats through a nomination process that includes debates and Americans voting in primary elections choose one candidate to represent their party in the general election. The winner of the general election then becomes the president. I kind of went over this a few minutes ago, but that's how this works. And then in the general election, of course, there are qualifications and stipulations. In order to be elected president, you have to be at least 35. Presidents serve 4-year terms with a maximum of 2 full terms or 10 years total. If you're a vice president and take over in the last couple of years of the previous president's term, then you could actually serve 2 more full terms after that for a total of 10 years. And the president is elected by the Electoral College, which is an indirect process in which individuals cast votes, but they do not directly elect the president. So that's basically what we do. We'll talk about that in just a second. But the Electoral College is who elects the president ultimately, but you got to be at least 35, and you can serve a maximum of 2 full terms or 10 years total. So the presidential general election, here you go. Once each party has identified the person that will be their nominee, the general election campaign begins. It is the winner of this election that becomes the president. The general election is always held on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. And originally, the president would be the person that won the majority of the votes in the Electoral College, and the vice president would be the person that won the second most votes in the Electoral College. That has changed. Okay, this change was made with the 12th Amendment in 1804. And so nowadays, the president is the one who wins the majority of the votes in the Electoral College, and the president has a vice presidential running mate already picked and established that whichever president wins, that person, that running mate becomes the automatic vice president. So the Electoral College is a method of indirectly electing the president and vice president of the U.S. It's based on the idea that the registered voters of each state will elect electors or members of the Electoral College, okay? And the Electoral College members will actually cast votes for president and vice president. But anyway, I know that we've always been taught that, hey, we elect the president, and the presidential election is the only election in the U.S. where all eligible voters get to vote. Okay, in our states, only people in those states get to vote, and in our districts and our cities, and so forth, only people in the districts or cities get to vote. But for president, everybody that's eligible gets to vote. But it's the Electoral College that technically elects the president. So how does that work? All right, so continuing this Electoral College, then what happens is on election night in November, we the people go and vote. Okay, let's just make this simple. We go and vote, and we choose who we want to be our president, the Republican or the Democrat. Now, just to use example, Utah, we usually vote, the majority of voters usually vote for the Republican. So let's just say that on election night, 55% of the voters that show up from Utah to vote in the presidential election, 55% vote for the Republican, 45% for the Democrat. Well, what happens then is the electors in the Electoral College from Utah, and we have 6 electors. You have the number of electors that's based on the number of senators plus reps from your state. We have 2 senators and 4 reps. So we have 6 electors, okay? They show up to the state capitol in early December, about a month after the general election, and they cast their vote in 2 separate elections for president and vice president, okay? But if they're smart, and if they want to keep their job, they vote according to how we, the people, voted back in November. So if we voted 55% for the Republican takes, the majority in Utah. And so in early December, the electors get together in Salt Lake City at the state capitol, and they throw their 6 electoral votes behind the Republican who won the people's vote. Okay. So that's how that works. And electoral college votes are usually all or nothing. Whichever candidate gets the majority of the people's votes from that state, they win all of that state's electoral votes. So you can see obviously why you'd want to win the big states, the ones with the most population, because you get the most electoral votes, but every state is important. And so on January 6th, the quote unquote certificates, the electoral votes from each state, are opened, read, and counted in the US Senate. And the individual receiving the absolute majority of the electoral votes, currently 270 of the 538 total electoral votes, for president becomes the US president, and the individual receiving the absolute majority of the electoral votes for vice president becomes vice president. But the vice president is attached to the president, they're running mates. So, of course, the electoral college is going to vote for, in the end, who the people vote for. Even though we say the electoral college elects the president, they vote for who the people votes for. Um, and it's been that way for forever, and we would anticipate that it will stay that way. But yeah, the electoral college votes according to how we voted as the individual voting populace. Okay, so that's how that works. And you can see here's examples of 2000, 2004. How the electoral college played out. President Bush, defeating Al Gore. There are a number of electoral votes. Sometimes the electoral votes are extremely close. In that 2000 election, it came down to one state, Florida, and it was kind of a crazy fiasco of an election, but that's how it turned out anyway. And 2004, you can see, still relatively close in the electoral vote. The popular vote, again, the person winning the popular vote doesn't always win the presidential election. They usually do, but not always, because it depends on what states they win and the electoral votes for those states. So how that works out. So anyway, that's the deal. And finally, then you can see the number of electoral votes. Currently, we're looking like this. In the 2016 election, our last election, this is how many electoral votes each state has. So obviously, the ones, if you can win California, New York, and Pennsylvania and Ohio and Florida and Texas. You win all these ones that have huge electoral numbers. Of course, you're on your way to the election, but um, every state is important. So sometimes it does come down to one or two states, and so that's why you got to win every state you can, right? If you're running for president. But anyway, this has been a long presentation, but this is political participation and voting in this country is of ultra importance. And I hope you guys, again, take the time to register to vote for the 2020 election if you haven't already, and that do your research and study up on the candidates and the because it's not just going to be for president in 2020. We also vote for other things in our state, in our cities, and so forth. So study up on the candidates, study up on the issues that are being presented, and make a difference at the voting booth, guys.